it splits this. It takes the username out. That's the username. And it also splits, it also takes this symbol after the @ symbol. It takes this string and considers that as the domain or tunnel name. That's the LNS now. So what happens is when the user passes its credentials to the LAC splits, looks at the username, and it identifies that, oh, here's the username with the username at domain name. So what the LAC does is, as soon as it sees a username like this, it immediately knows that the user is trying to establish an L2TP connection with the LNS. This is how the LAC finds out that the user is trying to establish a L2TP connection. That's by looking at the @ symbol in the username, through which the peer is trying to authenticate. So after looking at the group name LNS, what the LAC does is it finds the L2TP or the LNS corresponding to this group name. See, now the LAC has identified that the user wants to connect to this group name. But how does it know that it has to connect to 1.2.3.4 for this group? There has to be some correlation between these two, right? Yes, that correlation can be identified in many ways. Like, you can configure that locally on the LAC, or you can configure that on the Radius server. And when the LAC tries and when LAC gets some AV pairs from the Radius server, it identifies the LNS IP of 1.2.3.4 corresponding to this group, and it goes ahead and establishes the L2TP connection. Now, I don't want to dump too much information, but I think you can handle it right now. So now that's said and done, let's get into each step. As I told you earlier, the first step is the user trying to do a call setup with the LAC. This is a PPP call, and the user dials out to the LAC over the ISDN or the PSTN network, that is the POTS network, and it provides its username. It says the username which will provide is tacac at, oh wait, I'm sorry, because the username doesn't come until the challenge procedure, so I was wrong there. Just a moment. Now, after the LAC gets the credentials of the user, what it has to do next? That's correct. It has to authenticate the user. Authentication can be done either locally using the LAC's local database, or it can be done using a AAA server, like a Radius server, which is here. So here in this example, they're using a Radius server. So what it does is, after step number 4, the LAC goes ahead and sends the user. Remember I said that the username would be split into two, tacac at LNS. Now what the user does is it takes this, what the LAC does is it strips the username, and it strips into two parts, the username and the domain name. It takes the domain name and sends them over to the Radius server with the password of Cisco, because now the LAC has to identify how to connect to the LNS. There might be many LNSs. There might be LNS 1, there might be LNS 2, there might be LNS 3, and so on. Now how does the LAC know which LNS does the user wants to connect to? It identifies by using this, and it gets the IP address of the LNS through a Cisco AV pair. This AV pair, which is returned from the Radius server after authenticating the LNS name, will tell the LAC about what the IP address of the LNS is, what is the tunnel password which is going to be used by the LAC for setting up the L2TP connection, what is the tunnel type. The tunnel type will basically say it's an L2TP tunnel, and the LNS IP address which will point to the IP address of the LNS. Now that is clear. Now, if you have understood that much, okay, let's recap a bit. After the user initially creates a PPP session with the LAC, the user sends all of his or her credentials. The LAC requests for the credentials, the user sends the credentials, but wait a minute, the user has not been authenticated yet. The LAC is just, remember, the LAC is just acting as a gateway between the user and the LNS. So the LAC does not have any right to authenticate the user. The LNS has to authenticate the user. All the LAC does is it takes all these packets, creates a tunnel, and dumps them all to the LNS. Now, after the PPP call has been set up, the next step is for the LAC to identify which LNS should I connect to. It takes the LNS, the group name from the username which the user has provided. It authenticates this group using a radius server with the password of Cisco, and it gets some AV pairs from the radius server. Using these AV pairs, the LAC now has all the information it needs to establish an L2TP connection or an L2TP tunnel between itself and the specified LNS. Are you clear with that? Great. Now let's go on to the next step. Okay, now that I've cleared the whiteboard with all that stuff, let's go on to the next step, which is step number 7. Since LAC has all the parameters it needs to establish the L2TP connection, it goes ahead and contacts the LNS using this IP address which it got from the radius server. It goes ahead and contacts the LNS and it sends a tunnel setup message. The tunnel is set up and the tunnel authentication happens between the LAC and the LNS, where the L2TP connection is initially set up. What the L2TP LAC does is, after setting the tunnel setup, these two need to authenticate to each other. LAC needs to authenticate to the LNS for establishment of the PPP of the L2TP connections. So for these two to authenticate to each other, they have to issue challenges to each other. First, the LAC issues a challenge to the LNS. So you can see that challenge in this message number 8. The LAC sends over a challenge to the LNS. Now, this is the challenge. Now the LNS looks at the challenge and responds with its response. That is message number 9. And the LAC verifies that this message that the LNS is giving it the right credentials, and it sends a pass. Pass is nothing but an access accept or whatever. That's a pass. So now the LNS has been authenticated to the LAC. That means the LAC knows that the LNS is valid or it's authenticated. Now that's phase 1. Now in phase 2, the LNS has to authenticate LAC. We have authenticated the LNS to the LAC. Now it's time for the LAC to be authenticated to the LNS. So that happens by these 3 steps here. Okay, I'm just clearing out the screen here. Okay, now in step number 11, the same procedure happens which happened at step number 9. Instead of the LAC sending over the challenge, now the LNS sends over the challenge. You get it? And now LAC in step number 12, as soon as it sees the challenge, it sends its response to the LNS, and after authenticating the response, the LNS sends over a pass if the tunnel parameters are correct. So now at the end of all